That Pacific Ocean is mighty large, but there'll be no rowing the boat at USC this season, despite the opener against Western Michigan. We bring in Nick Dempsey from Conquest Chronicles, always the star on the stage when we talk USC football each and every Wednesday night right here on Mark Rogers TV. Right, Nick, we've got the schedule release. It's always interesting to see because the things that I look for are, of course, who do you play in the non-conference schedule? And you miss games within. So, for example, the Pac-12, you've got the 9 conference games, meaning you've got 11 potential opponents. So who don't you play? Are you missing a toughie, or are you missing the bye week against, i.e., Oregon State, as has been in the past? So your thoughts about a schedule that starts with a team that made the Cotton Bowl this past season, but why say no rowing of the boat? No PJ Fleck there at Western Michigan because he has, of course, moved on to Minnesota.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say when USC scheduled Western Michigan, they probably had no idea of who PJ Fleck was or what he could do. But 3 home games to start the year off. Western Michigan, probably not going to be the gimme game that the rent-a-victim, if you will, that USC was probably anticipating. Then they got their normal early matchup with Stanford the next week, and then Texas at home, I think is interesting. Texas has really struggled the last couple years, but they just brought in a new coach. Will he get it turned around by then? I don't know. It should be interesting. This Texas USC game strikes me as totally about recruiting, and UT wants to get into Southern California. Southern California absolutely wants to get into the hotbed of Texas. So that should hopefully be a very interesting matchup. Hopefully it goes better for USC than Alabama did this year. At California, then Friday night at Washington State, I think is that's just sort of screams trap game, because it's really tough for anybody to go up to the Palouse and win there, especially on a Friday night. Weird things just happen on Friday nights in college football. I don't know why. I don't know what's behind it. Then they come back. They got Oregon State at home, and then Utah at home. Utah is one of those teams that are always tougher than they appear, and then always sort of at the last minute kind of fall short of where they could be. This seems to be Utah's MO. But the last time last season Utah beat USC at home in a heartbreaker. I think we all remember that. That was actually the last time the Trojans lost a football game. And then the year before that was the infamous thumping that USC gave the Utes in Los Angeles. Then you got at Notre Dame, which means they're playing third week of October. Notre Dame's another team that should be a really good game. But man, was Notre Dame a bad football team last year. So I have no idea what Notre Dame we're going to see next year. I know it's always tough to go into South Bend and win. It's always tough to go across to the other side of the country and beat a rival. But if we get 4-8 Notre Dame that we saw in 2016, I'm pretty comfortable with that. If we get 2015's Notre Dame, then that's going to be a heck of a matchup. And then back on the road for the Halloween game, October 28th. Arizona State is another team that I think underachieved last year. Could be really interesting game, or it could be another blowout. The Arizona Wildcats, I'm sorry, my apologies to the Wildcat Nation, but until they show me otherwise, I'm not really worried about that game at this point. Now, the last 2 weeks, this is where it gets interesting. They go on the road up into the mountains at Colorado. That could be a really good game, assuming Colorado is for real and they're not a fluke. This wasn't just like a one-and-done great season. Real great things are happening at Colorado. Assuming that could be a really, really interesting matchup, possibly with national importance. If both teams, certainly for Pac-12 South contention, it almost feels like that's going to be a huge game deciding that. Excuse me. And then the next week they've got UCLA. They wrap it up back in the Coliseum. You're talking rivalry, so it's always going to be intense. But here's my biggest concern looking at the schedule: 12 straight games. There's no bye week there until November 25th, Thanksgiving. I believe it's probably going to be. That's concerning because almost every Pac-12 team that gets stuck with that 12 straight schedule, almost always underperforms their abilities. In 2016, it was Stanford, picked to win the conference, grossly underperformed. The year before that, I believe it was Arizona. But it was an absolute dumpster fire. So my biggest concern is not necessarily any one of these teams. In fairness, there's no like block stretch of games where you think, oh, they can't get through that. It's the lack of a bye week. Going 12 straight's really tough to do. I'm not even sure you go 12 straight in the pros without a bye week. So I think that's the biggest concern. History suggests you're not going to do well when you go 12 straight.
So I mentioned off the top what I look at are non-conference games and who you miss in conference play. We mentioned Washington. That's good for the record, should be, even though, of course, the Trojans went to Seattle and played extremely well this past season, and they miss Oregon. We don't know what kind of Ducks team is going to show up under Willie Taggart in year one. So the next thing that comes to mind is what you just mentioned. What is the toughest stretch? And I can't find a tough stretch. The toughest stretch may be out of the gate with Western Michigan, Stanford, and Texas, depending on what type of Texas team Tom Herman's able to field in his first year. So Western Michigan, Stanford, and Texas, as we mentioned, there is no give me. There is no buy this week, and I mean a buy in quotes as well as no buy in terms of the schedule. They don't have that type of game. The easiest game might be the conference game that you matched, that you mentioned the first week of November against Arizona. That may turn out to be the easiest week on the schedule. So the Texas game will have all the trappings of a prestigious matchup. We'll see how good Texas is. They will have 2 games under their belt, but the scene shifts, I know, from the Rose Bowl to the LA Coliseum, but USC is going to have the dark jerseys on. Texas is going to have the road whites. It's going to have possibly, as it moves to a night game, possibly at that point in the season, even if Texas turns out to be a dumpster fire, they might be 2-0. So we'll have at least the trappings of a huge game. And so it'll have that nighttime look that will be reminiscent of what it looked like at the Rose Bowl 11 years ago for the national championship game. Besides that, again, not a gauntlet. It looks difficult because UCLA, Notre Dame, and Texas are down. Will they be down in 2017? Yeah. Time will tell. But it could be an extremely difficult schedule, one that I ranked as easily one of the 5 toughest schedules in college football last year. And certainly USC doesn't dodge anyone, so I give them all respect. They can't vouch for the other program and run their program for them to make sure that Notre Dame's Notre Dame and Texas is Texas, but they certainly schedule as tough as anybody in the country year in and year out.
Yeah, and this is I think you're right. This could turn out to be one of the toughest schedules in the nation. It could also turn out to be one of the easiest. Western Michigan without PJ Fleck, maybe they're not that great. Maybe Stanford can't quite get things turned around, and they're not as great. Texas is a first year as a head coach. Or with the new head coach, maybe Arizona State once again underperforms. Maybe Utah doesn't quite get to 8-4 again. Maybe Notre Dame and UCLA are also big flops. Maybe Colorado was a fluke, and they were a one and done. So there's a bunch of bowl eligible teams here on the schedule. There's a bunch of teams on here that could and possibly should compete for the New Year's Six bowl games. There's also a lot of teams on here that fell well below expectations coming into 2016. So a lot of question marks on the schedule, but I think USC is talented enough to beat any team on this schedule that we're looking at. But what I don't know is if they can do it 12 straight times.
So at least I got half of what I wanted, and that's a USC-UCLA final game of the season. So for the USC schedule, it works out that way, but UCLA most likely, without looking at the Bruins schedule, will play Stanford as they have in recent years as their final game, I'm guessing. but the potential bye week comes in on November 25th for USC before the Pac-12 championship game, or it's just the end of the season and you wait for your bowl game and have an extra week off to practice. All right, it's the USC schedule release for 2017, and it's pretty intriguing with the likes of Western Michigan, Texas, and Notre Dame out of conference. Nick Dempsey from Conquest Chronicles joining us to knock out our weekly USC segment. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Anytime, Mark.